Hi, welcome to another Now Playing vlog where I talk about some of the games I've been playing lately and what I think of them. The games in this video were voted on by my Patreon backers. If you'd like to help Actual grow bigger and better, go to patreon.com/Actual. There are links to all the games mentioned in the description below. Let's get on with it. Legacy of Dragonholt is a choose-your-own-adventure storytelling game from Fantasy Flight Games. And this is set in a fantasy universe where, much like these games that you might have played as a kid where you're reading through books and you're turning to different pages, you're doing the same thing. You create these fantasy characters at the start, humans or elves or gnomes, that kind of thing, and then you take them through the story. The trouble was that we found that we spent a long time building our characters, getting invested. They really build the world for you and tell you about all the different skills that you can have and why you might pick one over the other. And we wanted to get into that, and then we built our characters only for them to kind of feel like bit players, because the way you read this story, you're just experiencing it kind of from outside. You're standing nearby and your characters might occasionally be called upon for skills, but you're not really role-playing those characters in the way that you would in a role-playing game. The other problem that I had with the game was just that the story didn't advance quick enough. So the best thing about Legacy of Dragonholt is that it's brilliantly written. It's classic fantasy, which isn't necessary to my taste, but there's nothing cringy or annoying about the writing. It flows and it's engrossing, at least for a bit, and the characters are well drawn and the dialogue's decent, and yet it just doesn't get anywhere quick enough. So we played the first opening scenario, which you would imagine is kind of the first 10 minutes of a film or the first chapter in a book, and it took us hours. And then we ended up playing about 6 hours of the game and still felt like we were only in the second chapter or the first 20 minutes of the film. Not enough had happened. There's this mystery that starts to unravel, and that's what hooked us. We wanted to play a bit more to try and understand where it went. And we would go and visit people and have encounters, and all the encounters would be so opening. They would be just, oh, we meet this person for the first time, we learn a bit about them. Oh, there's a little hint that they might know something, but then you have to come back again and again, and there was just so much padding, and it's nicely written padding, but we wanted things to advance, and we felt like in the same amount of time that it took us to play Legacy of Dragonholt, where very little happened, we could have played 2 or 3 Sherlock Holmes consulting detective stories and solved those mysteries and felt really engrossed by them. And so Legacy of Dragonholt's biggest flaw for us was it just took too long. And so there's a lot there. These books are thick and there's a lot of writing. It's impressive. I can't believe almost how much they've written and been able to produce. I don't know how long this game took to write, but it's clearly a labor of love. And yet for us it took too long. There's just too much there. You want to advance that story quicker, and the world and everything else seemed interesting, but it didn't give us enough to hook on every sort of hour of gameplay to make us want to keep going again and again. And the system, the storytelling system, I think is quite clever. The way it tracks the things that you've seen and the moments that you've had, so that if you visit somewhere again, it has a knowledge. That's interesting. The way you take turns, I think, is a bit wonky, and it feels much more like a solo game, because it sort of might be my turn and I get to use my skill points, or maybe it's my girlfriend's turn and she can use her skill points, but really we're just reading it together, and we're both there, why can't we both be involved? And the other reason it feels like a solo game is there's just so much reading, and I think it can just get a bit tiring, a bit boring to be constantly reading out loud to each other, where the decisions aren't that engrossing. There isn't the discussion that you might have in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. And so it feels like the sort of game that you should play on your own and just be reading through these books. But I'm not a solo gamer, and that just doesn't really interest me. So if you are a solo gamer, there's certainly a lot of story here. I'm just not sure that it advances quick enough or has enough going on. So it's a pass for us for Legacy of Dragonholt. Argh is a small bluffing card game that I picked up at Essen, and this one is quite an unassuming little box, but it's a really interesting game in there. On your turn, you pick a card from 3 different piles. They're different colours, and they have different makeups in those decks that you know what you get. You've got a little card reference that tells you what's in each deck. You take the card, you look at it, and then you have to decide what to do with it. You can put it face down in front of yourself, or you can offer it to another player in the game, and they have to then decide to reject it, in which case it goes face up in front of you, or accept it, in which case it goes face up in front of them. And so immediately you're bluffing with every card that you play, because if you put a card face down in front of you, it can be stolen. Because on your turn, you can decide whether to take a card from one of those piles or from another player. And so putting a card face down is really risky because it could be stolen. Of course, you could put a bad card face down, trying to tempt other people to steal it from you. What you're trying to do is you're trying to collect 2 parts of a bomb. If you get 2 bomb cards, there's 1 in each colored deck, then you win the game immediately. And so if you have that bomb card, do you play it face down, hoping that somebody won't steal it, or do you offer it to someone? You can tell them what it is. Of course, you could be bluffing, lying, saying it's something else, and try and double bluff them, try and give them a really good card, hoping that they'll reject it, thinking it's a bad card. Everyone can see what's in the different decks, so they know what it might be, and so you can threaten them with something that it could be, but it actually isn't. So there's good cards and bad cards. That's the way to immediately win the game. But if nobody gets 2 bomb cards and one of the decks runs out, then you count up points. And so there are point cards that you're also trying to collect to have the most points at the end of the game. There are negative point cards. Then there are ways to cancel out good cards, cancel out bad cards. And so if somebody's got this really high scoring card, you want to give them the card that's going to cancel that out so they got no points at the end of the game. There's also these spy cards, which basically mean that you lose. You cannot win the game if you have 1 spy card. If you have 2 spy cards, they cancel each other out and you can win the game. If you have 3 spy cards, you're losing again. And there's just lots of different ways the game can end up. And yet it plays in like 5-10 minutes. And it's such a clever game that allows for so much bluffing and doublethink and trying to force people to take what you want. If you've ever played cockroach poker, it's a little bit similar where you offer cards to players, you tell them what it is, and they have to decide whether to trust you or not. And there's exactly the same amount of trust in this game, but with a bit more of a game to it, a bit more thought to what the cards might be, what card you might be sending to them, what card you might really want for yourself, and which deck you've picked it from. And the difference to cockroach poker is that there's a winner in this game. In cockroach poker, one of the downsides to it really is that nobody wins, it's just one person loses. In Argh, there is a winner and you can really feel like you bluffed your way to victory. It's such a brilliant, simple game. If you've got 4 players, you really just have to play it once and then you're in and you understand how it works. And it's such a blast if everyone gets into that bluffing and trying to understand how everyone's playing each other. I had a game where I had one of the bombs. I think everyone knew that I had it. I picked up that other bomb and I offer it to the person with the 3rd bomb. So they can win the game if they take it, or I can win the game if they give it back to me, and they did, and it just felt amazing. So I'm giving this game actual love. I think it absolutely deserves it. It's a really great, simple bluffing card game. Such a nice small box. The artwork's decent as well. It's so immediate to get into, and yet it really packs a punch. It'll have you in hysterics. There's just a great interaction to it. So it's absolutely a game that I would recommend to anyone that sounds like they like a short bluffing card game. So don't let this one go under your radar, because I know it's from a smallish French publisher, and it might not have reached the whole world yet after coming out at Essen, but it's definitely one worth checking out. That's Argh. Actual love. Sentient is a game from Renegade Games, and this is a puzzly experience with some dice and cards. There is a theme of AI robots, but honestly, the theme doesn't really come through. But the game itself is interesting gameplay-wise. You have these dice that you roll at the start of every round. I believe they represent your robots. And you are taking cards and trying to place them in such a way to score the most points. So each of the different types of cards want certain things from where you place them. So they're asking something of the dice to the left and the right of where you place it. So it might say it wants the card on the left to be bigger than the card on the right, or it wants them both to be the same number. And based on if you complete that puzzle, you will score points off that card at the end of the round. So it's about which cards you take from the pool that everyone is selecting from in turn, and then where you place them. The other tricky thing is that when you place cards, they will manipulate the dice that you have. So they'll be set at certain numbers, but then you'll have to maybe put one up or put one down. And so that's going to then affect the way those dice connect to the other cards that are in play, adjacent to the other side. And so it's a really interesting, thinky puzzle that is satisfying as you sit there and work out which cards can be best for you. How are you going to best score points? Because some of the cards will score more than others, but they're a bit more demanding. How do you use your dice for that round? The other way that you score points in the game is an area control thing. When you place your workers to select a card, you are also controlling that area possibly to win. There's a sort of different type of set collection, really, and they are multipliers of the cards that you've collected. So you're also, that is influencing the decision you make and the cards you pick, because when you place a worker, that's how you get the cards, but it's also how you win these multipliers that are going to get you more points at the end of the game. So there's always interesting decisions in this game, and that's really it. It's a very simple system in terms of learning those rules and getting straight into the gameplay. Another aspect that adds decisions is that you have these workers that you can accompany your main workers with to improve your area control winning, or you can use them to cancel out the dice manipulation on these cards, which will help you a bit with your puzzle, help you not throw things off. So you can basically block a plus or a minus symbol and stop those dice from being changed. And so deciding how to use those workers is another really interesting decision. My only real problem with the game is that it just lacks interaction. It feels like quite a solitary experience. There is the area control that you're competing with other players, but you're not really massively thinking about what other people want. You're really just thinking about what you want. And so you spend a lot of time in your head just thinking about the puzzle. And there's also a little bit of downtime, because you're generally going to want to wait till your turn to see which cards are going to be available, because somebody else has taken one on their turn, and then decide how to complete your puzzle. Meantime, everyone else is just waiting for you to do that. And so that's a bit frustrating. So I think that Sentient is a really interesting challenge. I think it is a really cool game, but it didn't necessarily have the staying power for me. I tend to like games with a bit more interaction with the other players at the table, to feel like I'm not just there on my own, that I'm here for a social experience, and Sentient doesn't really have that for me. It's an incredible production. The dice are really nice, and the artwork's very nice as well. It's a good box size for this kind of size game, the meatiness of it. So I think it definitely could be one for you if you like the sound of that challenge. I think it's a really impressive game. It just wasn't one for me long term. That's Sentient. Invisible Ink is a party game that I picked up at Essen last year. This is a drawing game. I'm always into party drawing games. And the unique twist with this one is that you can't always see what is being drawn. So it comes with a yellow highlighter and then some red glasses that if you wear them, you can't see the yellow highlighter on a white piece of paper. So you roll the dice at the start of the round, and it determines whether the person drawing it can't see what they're drawing, or whether the people guessing can't see what they're guessing. And so you have to follow their hand carefully and try and work out the shape that they're drawing without actually being able to see the pattern on the bit of paper. And it works really well. Like, you absolutely can't see what they're drawing, and yet there is a challenge, enough of a challenge to try and follow those shapes and work it out. It also has 2 difficulty modes. One of them basically gives you 2 different words, and you want to get them to guess one word before the other one, because then you'll get more points. So one of the words is a bit more obvious, a bit easier to guess, and so you kind of have to draw it in such a way that you go a bit around the houses and then get them to guess the second one second. And the timer is quite short, so it can be quite tricky. You can't go really slowly and let people follow the shape. You've got to do it quickly. One thing I found is that nobody's really watching the timer because they're trying to guess, so it would be better if it was an alarm or something so that you're told, because often everyone just runs over because everyone's playing the game. You're either drawing or guessing. Nobody's paying attention to the timer because that means you're not focused on what's being drawn. I mean, that's just how it goes with some of these games. The more difficult setting has you drawing something, but you get punished. You don't get any points if they guess the other word. So it might be two things that are a bit similar in shape, maybe like a steering wheel and a donut. And somebody guesses donut when they were supposed to be guessing steering wheel, then you don't get any points. The round is over. And I think that one's quite nice, although I did find the words to be a bit too distinct. Like, it was actually quite easy sometimes to draw and not have people guess the other thing. But I guess that's probably to help kids. This would be a great game for kids or families. It is a very simple party game, almost a classic party game, a bit like Pictionary. There isn't, aside from the twist of going blind, there isn't that much else to it. And yeah, I think it works. I think it's fun. We had a lot of fun with it. It isn't one that you want to play over and over again, like you might with Codenames or something like that, or Telestrations. But I think it does what it sets out to do really nicely. I think that it's a fun party game. Of course, I love party drawing games, and so there are quite a few that I would prefer over Invisible Ink, but I would certainly play this one again and have fun with it. That's Invisible Ink. Professor Evil and the Citadel of Time is a cooperative game about trying to stop a bad guy from destroying a bunch of historical artifacts. You're breaking into Professor Evil's mansion. You're trying to unlock doors, turn off switches, and steal these items before he can destroy them, because there's a timer in the game and you can see when he's about to destroy them. So you have to get them before he gets to them first. And it's a light cooperative game. It's reminiscent of Forbidden Island, that kind of level. The rules are very simple. It's very easy to get into and understand. On your turn, you have some action points. You're going through doors, unlocking them, turning off switches, stealing items, and you're trying to do it in the most efficient way possible and team up with your neighbors. You also have these action cards that give you special abilities, and you each have slightly different asymmetric powers. So one person's good with switches, one person's good with doors, things like that. The trouble that I have with the game is that the theme doesn't really come through for me. It feels very mechanical. What you're doing, it just feels like the game mechanisms are creating this artificial environment to make it difficult without it making any real sense with the theme. And it's so hard to describe, because something like Pandemic is quite a simple cooperative system, and yet you feel a thematic pressure of trying to race across the world and stop outbreaks from happening. And in Professor Evil, it doesn't feel like I'm breaking into something or that I'm having to stop a bad guy from destroying these precious artifacts. It just feels like I'm turning off switches when I can, and that's really my main problem with the game, is that it doesn't evoke any theme for me. The other issue that I have with the gameplay is that it's quite random. So the way the AI in the game works is that at the end of every turn you roll some dice, and so that controls how the professor moves through the mansion, and he will go through closing doors that you've opened, turning off switches that you've turned on, or the other way around, and kicking you out of the mansion if he runs into you. And that is so hard to predict, because he can end up moving 1, 2, or 3 spaces in 3 different directions. And so you will work really hard, do these things to try and save a certain artifact, and then he'll completely reverse everything you did, and you had no way of predicting that, because he could have ended up in a whole load of different places in the mansion. And so there are a few ways to mitigate that with action cards in the game, but they are really the exception, and the rest of the time you do something and it gets cancelled out, and then maybe the next player tries to do the same thing and it gets cancelled out, and then finally somebody does it and it doesn't get cancelled out because the professor goes in a different direction, and hooray, that time you actually got to achieve what you wanted to achieve. And I just prefer a cooperative game like Pandemic where there's a bit more predictability to the threat. You don't always know what's going to happen, but you have an idea of where things are going to take place and what you can expect, and you are allowed, that helps you plan for things. And in Professor Evil there just isn't as much of that. So there is a bit of clever decision making with the way that you use your action cards, but that's really it. There doesn't feel that much room for clever kind of working with the other players when everything can just collapse at the end of any given turn. So I'm afraid the theme sounded interesting, but Professor Evil's gameplay just wasn't a fun cooperative experience for us. The artwork is certainly very nice, production's very good, the character art is good. I felt that the board, the graphic design, for some reason, I found it quite hard to look at and just visually get, in the way that cooperative games are a puzzle to be solved, and sometimes you can kind of get used to the way the game lays out, and you kind of look at it and you know what you need to do. And there's something about the color palette with the board, it was just hard to grasp visually. I'm not a graphic designer, I can't say how to fix that, but it was just an issue that we had. So, bit disappointing for me. That's Professor Evil and the Citadel of Time. Those were some of the games I've been playing lately. I've put links to where you can buy all of them in the description below. If you like this video and you want to see more in this series, then please subscribe to the channel. And if you want to help the channel grow bigger and better, go to patreon.com/actuallol. I'm John Purkis. Thanks for watching.